closest the American mainland came to being threatened occurred in the Aleutian Islands. As for other parts of Alaska, the outbreak of hostilities found the folks in Bethel doing pretty much what they had always done.
Trapping, mostly. Going to the canneries down, you know, working the canneries down the bay.
Working the steamboats in the summertime.
Steamboats.
There was mining at Nyack and at Platinum. The work was pretty much seasonal. You worked spring, summer, and fall. Took it easy during the wintertime, waited for the next spring.
Springtime on the Kuskokwim in the early 1940s meant the return of the riverboats.
Well, in 1940, the Tana and the Quick Step had been retired. The Wallace Langley was in use. The Langley was built locally here in Bethel on the island across. And the Northwestern was on the river in those years. She had been towed up from the Columbia River. Those were the two that were in use during the war years, during the early 40s.
And in Bethel itself, stop if you've heard it before.
It was wet.
Very wet?
Very wet. We had 3 liquor stores that time, I think.
Any bars?
One bar. McDonald's bar.
McDonald's bar and the Roadhouse.
But the battle for control of the North Pacific Ocean quickly heated up. Part of the U.S. military's response to the invasion of the Aleutian chain was to send a 1,200-man contingent to Bethel. People questioned the need to maintain an outpost here in town.
I think it goes back to the fact that they were still afraid of an invasion through the Aleutians. There was a lot of talk about that at the time. That's why the Territorial Guard was established, was to see there was no dew line then, there was no
absolutely nothing.
Absolutely nothing between Japan and Anchorage except a bunch of Eskimos out there with a 30-06.
Although pretty far off the beaten track and serving only as a transportation and signals hub, the Army presence in Bethel did have an impact upon the town.
The big impact we had was we couldn't get any girlfriends.
Yeah, I mentioned that. I mentioned that. I told him I thought the biggest impact would have been on the teenage generation. The kids that weren't used to that type of life, and all of a sudden, whambo, they were right in the middle of it. I don't think it had much of an impact on the rural folks. I mean,
no.
Here they come in for a couple of years and moved on out and so on. But and there were soldiers that married some of the girls up here, and when the whole thing was over, they decided it wouldn't be a good idea to haul them out to the States, and they divorced them.
I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places that this heart and mind embraces all day through. Small cafe, the park.
The base, called Todd Airfield, was built by Morrison Knudsen, a giant civilian construction firm, who originally intended the airfield for a section of land now occupied by the library.
Well, they come in at the wrong time, right about the middle of July when the rainy season started. They had big ukes and everything, and they had, you couldn't even get down to the tank farm. It was all up to there in mud, you know. So they abandoned that, and they hired, I don't know, 400 or 580 boys and cut brush over there, and that's built the airport over there.
Hundreds of Quonset huts were erected across the river, the ultimate site of the airfield.
And I bought 12 of them. 6 of them I kept for the shop down there, and the other 6 I bought for people. I bought one for Chris Dahl. I bought, you know, some of the old-timers in town that wanted one. And they were just thick all over the woods there. Mm-hmm. You had a heck of a time that you bought them by number, you know.
Yeah.
And you'd have a hell of a time finding the number. They were just all over.
Yeah, I bought one too. Seemed like I paid $35 for it.
Yeah, you got a good deal. I paid $50 for mine.
Many of those Quonsets are still to be seen around town, having been sold off as Army surplus and brought over by local residents after the Army abandoned the base in 1944. Despite its less than strategic location, the base enjoyed one of the few pleasures of the war, a visit by the one and only Bob Hope. The base also served as the communications hub for a network of far-flung listening outposts spread all up and down the Bering Sea coastline.
Well, the Second World War made an impact not only on the town of Bethel itself, but it also made quite an impact on the small Eskimo villages located along the Bering Coast rim. The Japanese were in the Aleutians. They had occupied the islands of Attu and Kiska. There was considerable talk about a full-scale invasion of coming through Alaska down through the Canadian provinces into the Pacific Northwest. Out of Anchorage, back in the early 40s, came a Major Marston, whom every Eskimo on the coast and all of us who were here at the time referred to as muktuk, due to the fact that he loved to eat muktuk. He arrived out at Nelson Island, called a meeting of the village, and explained that the President of the United States, who was Franklin Roosevelt at that time, wanted some eyes and some ears out along the Bering Sea coast. That he didn't want to send soldiers from Florida or Texas or Louisiana up into the Arctic where they had no knowledge of conditions, but wanted people who were familiar with the country, who could spot the head of a seal against an ice floe at 1,000 yards, to act as the eyes and ears of the military. And so was formed the Tanunuk Company of the old Alaska Territorial Guard.
Using a radio that Captain Charlie Guinn built himself, the Territorial Guards were in constant touch with Bethel's early aircraft warning site.
Obviously, there was no invasion. The Japanese were defeated at the Battle of Attu, but through the many, many months that the Guard operated, there wasn't a sound in the sky, there wasn't a light that flashed in the night at sea, there wasn't the outline of a ship against the shoreline that wasn't immediately reported to the military in Bethel.
One of the darker moments of the war in Bethel came when the military police showed up here and arrested an American citizen, a longtime Bethel resident. His only crime, he was of Japanese descent. His name was Tony Sumai, and he died in an American internment camp.
He was one of the most big-hearted men that I've ever known. Many occasions that a traveler going from Bethel back home to one of the villages would stop in and have a cup of coffee with Tony, arrive back in his village and unload his sled and find a haunch of reindeer in there that wasn't there when he left Bethel, or a bundle of dry fish that wasn't there when he left Bethel.
The soldiers came and went after 3 years in Bethel. The physical impact of their presence is easy to assess. The remains of an airfield across the river and a scattering of Quonset huts about town. The sociological and cultural impacts are not as clear-cut. The legacy of those 1,200 GIs may never be known, but Bethel was never the same.
Fools rush in where angels fear to tread, and so I come to you.